Let's bring in our panel. Joining me from Beirut is Rend Al-Rahim. She served as Iraq's representative and chief of mission to the United States from 2003 to 2005. And she is president of the Iraq Foundation. Also with us from Erbil, Iraq, is Hiwa Osman. He is an Iraqi-Kurdish journalist and commentator, and he has served as a media advisor to former President Jalal Talabani. And with us from San Francisco is Richard Becker. He is a coordinator for a coalition called Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's start in Beirut. Rend Al-Rahim, when President Bush went on television 15 years ago to announce the start of the war, he sought to justify the war by saying that the intention was, and I'm quoting here, to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. We know now that the United States was acting on faulty intelligence, on inaccurate intelligence. Some have said it was an outright lie. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. How much does that concern you?
You know, for Iraqis, and I think the majority of Iraqis, defend the Iraqi people was the important issue and the operative words. And Iraqis who were engaged with the U.S. administration at the time essentially pressed the issue on human rights, and that this regime was a murderous regime and was murdering its own people. Our issue as Iraqis, or as Iraqi Americans or Iraqi Brits and so on, was not the weapons of mass destruction so much, which were of course important for the U.S., but for the Iraqis it was the human rights issue, the mass killings that were going on, the torture, the deportations, and so on. So to defend the Iraqi people was still very much an operative phrase and very important for Iraq. And I think this is something that everybody stressed, although the U.S. administration did not stress it because they focused on the weapons of mass destruction, which, as you say, in the end turned out to be not true.
Okay, let's get the view from Hiwa Osman. He's in Erbil. And Hiwa Osman, looking back at the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost, the millions of people who were displaced, the devastation of an entire country, what is the toll that's been taken on Iraq?
Well, to start off with, there are two Iraqs. There were the Kurdish Iraq and the Arab Iraq. For the Kurdish Iraq, things became better, definitely, for a while. Things were more stable because the Americans did not rule the area directly. Back in 2003 and after the invasion, the Americans literally, and under the leadership of Paul Bremer, who was completely unaware of what's going on in Iraq, incompetent, and he just destroyed the state totally. The people he put in place to run the country were definitely unable to rebuild that state. So we ended up with a situation of a destroyed society by the former regime of Saddam Hussein and a destroyed state by Paul Bremer and the Americans who were present in Iraq. And the new guys, the new people who took power, who came into all governments, basically, who came into power, were unable to rebuild neither. Today we see an extremely fragmented society, a very corrupt state. Security is still very fragile, despite the recent victory on ISIS. But there are no foundations of a real state, and it remains, Iraq to this day remains a failed state, extremely corrupt, both in Kurdistan and in the Arab Iraq. Security in the Kurdish region is a little bit better, but we are really not seeing a functional state, neither in Kurdistan nor in the rest of the country.
Richard Becker, critics of this war have dubbed it the biggest political blunder that has ever been perpetrated by the United States. Yet there was a big political campaign by the Bush administration to get into this war. What do you make of what Rend Al-Rahim just told us, that this was less about finding weapons of mass destruction and more about defending the Iraqi people?
Well, I think it was about neither. The intelligence that the Bush administration and the Blair administration in England presented to the people was not faulty intelligence, it was falsified. It was falsified intelligence, and it was deliberately falsified. Blair, Condoleezza Rice, Cheney, all of them made references to let not the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud or something akin to that, or that that London, in 45 minutes, London could be destroyed by Iraq. They knew that they were lying, and they were lying in order to rally public opinion behind a war. We were in the Answer Coalition organizing hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of the United States, in Washington, in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, against that war, and many people were against it, but many people were won over to the war on the basis of false intelligence. And I have to say this, those who perpetrated this war, who today live in luxury, really have never been held accountable for what they did. This was a war fought for global domination. This was the strategy of the neocons, that to dominate the Middle East would mean that they could dominate the world, and that was the national security strategy that was signed by Bush just in the months prior to the invasion of Iraq, the illegal, unjust invasion of Iraq. And it also opened the door for the crises in Syria that we see. It opened the door for al-qaeda in Mesopotamia to be established, which didn't exist before, and out of that came ISIS.
Okay, at this point, let's bring in Abdel Bari Atwan. He joins us from London. He is the editor-in-chief of Rai-al-Youm. That's a digital news and opinion site. And Abdel Bari Atwan, what is your view of the Iraq invasion 15 years on?
Well, actually, I am surprised with our colleague in Lebanon when she said it wasn't actually the problem of weapon of mass destruction saga. It was actually the human rights. Let me ask whether this invasion, which was based on fabrication, actually, did help the human rights in Iraq. About 1 million people were killed in Iraq because of this invasion, this occupation of the Iraqis and the Iraq country. Is what happened in Abu Ghraib prison, actually, the torture, which was a huge scandal, was it actually a rosy side or picture of the American human rights in Iraq? Iraq was destroyed completely. Iraqi people were starved. So about 12 years before this invasion, and at least 7 years after this invasion, about 4 million, people, actually, children were infant without any parents, actually. About 1 million widows actually lost their husband. So I don't know whether this is actually a good record of human rights or not. This is one point. Second point, Iraq is dismembered completely. There is no Iraqi identity now, a unifying Iraqi identity. We have Kurds, we have Muslims, we have Shia, we have Arabs, we have Turkomans. We don't have the united Iraqi identity, which actually gel people together, which Iraq also lost its role in the whole of the Middle East. So it is a full disaster.
All right.
Iraq became the incubator of the Islamic State, the most dangerous terrorist organization in our recent history. So, it was actually the American invasion which caused all these miserable situations, not only for the Iraqis, but for the whole of the Middle East. It is a war crime.
Okay.
It is a crime against humanity, to be honest. I'm surprised why those people did not actually brought to justice.
I'd like to respond to this. There are two diametrically opposed views of what happened in 2003. There is the view, of course, of the anti-war party, the anti-war groups, which I respect completely and I understand. And then there is the view from Iraq. And I think the people who are not in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, who were in California and London, simply don't understand what the Iraqi people lived under the regime of Saddam Hussein. They think it was a benign regime. They think it's a regime that did not commit human rights. They think it's a regime that could have continued peacefully with its own people and in the region. They forget the invasion of Kuwait. They forget the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis under the regime. They forget the killings, the extrajudicial killings that happened during the 1980s. They forget Halabja in Kurdistan. They forget Anfal. They forget the killings in the marshes. This regime was murdering its own people. If you're sitting in London, you may not have that perspective.
Okay.
If you're sitting in California, you don't have the perspective. But if you're sitting in Iraq, you do.
I think it's disgraceful.
And when we say, when we talk about war crimes and we talk about crimes against humanity, it was Saddam Hussein who committed crimes against humanity.
All right,
and the international community has a responsibility to protect. And this is what Iraqis were asking for.
Okay, let me get the response from the other guests.
Were there mistakes made after that? I understand that there were, and I accept that there were mistakes. But the removal of Saddam's regime was welcomed and is still welcomed by the majority of the Iraqi people. So I don't think it's good enough to sit there in the luxury of London and in the luxury of California and say that the invasion and the removal of Saddam Hussein perpetrated war crimes and crimes against humanity. Saddam was doing that already against the Iraqi people.
Okay, let me get
sorry about
all right,
this,
all right, Rend Al-Rahim. Let me get the response from our other guests. Richard, go ahead.
Well, I just think it's terrible to defend an attack on your own country. I think it's disgraceful. An attack on your own country, which has caused such devastation to Iraq. I have to say that, to be very honest, with all due respect. But, you know, what the United States did this was not carried out this war and the war crimes that they carried out. Is life better for people in Iraq today? I don't think so. I think that the society was torn to shreds by the invasion and by the occupation and its policies that followed. But what we've seen really now is not just 15 years, but we've seen 27 years of sanctions, blockade, war, invasion, bombing, destruction of the civilian infrastructure by the United States and by Britain and its other allies. These are war crimes against that country. And to think that the United States did this for humanitarian purposes, humanitarian reasons, completely ignores the history of the United States and the reality of U.S. foreign policy.